Hello and welcome to the Global Hog Industry Virtual Conference Update. I'm Ann Hess. Separating farming and non-farming assets between heirs, bringing in outside investors and management, and preparing for life's unexpected challenges are just a few of the issues to consider when building a succession plan for your farming operation. Joining us to walk through various succession planning scenarios and to discuss opportunities and challenges within each plan is Jim Marzoff, Vice President of Business for Pipestone. Welcome, Jim, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Ann. Appreciate you having me.
Before we dive into our discussion today, I'd like to remind the audience you can type your questions at any time into the chat. This conversation is featuring topics to agribusiness across the board. So we're not just live streaming to National Hog Farmers social media feeds. We also have feedstuffs and beef. So please post your questions directly in the comments there, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can during today's session. So Jim, let's start with you telling us a little bit more about your background and your role within Pipestone.
Sure. Well, I'm, as you said, I'm the Vice President of Pipestone Business here at Pipestone. Obviously, Pipestone, we focus almost primarily on pork producers and pork production. Prior to Pipestone, well, let me back up. So Pipestone Business, we are really trying to support the grow finish producer in our work here. We have a management company that does a lot of sow farm management, and my team really focuses on the downstream grow finish producer who's bringing those pigs from the farms back home to raise them up. And what we like to do is try to support them on the business side. So we have production records and financial records and benchmarking that we do. We do business advisory. We have a labor solution for farm labor that's been very popular. And then we also have production supervision, where we actually work with growers and owners to make sure that the production system is working well. Prior to Pipestone, as it maybe says in my bio, I have 25 years of experience really serving as a business advisor and a financial advisor in the pork and production agriculture spaces. So excited to be here today. This will be fun.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your wealth of knowledge. I think in agriculture, most operations, we just assume they're passing that family farm onto family. Are you still seeing that is the case? Or are you seeing more outside professionals entering the business?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And almost, so the profile of my farms that I work with are family farms. Family members are key components of that. And I would say for almost all of them, one of their values or mission, their mission on their farm is to transition it to the next generation. And so I see very rarely that an outside organization will come in as part of that transition, like to manage the farm. That rarely happens in the population that I serve. And I would say mostly because while these farms are big business, they're not big enough for an outside organization really to get super interested in providing management. What I do see a lot of is, as I said earlier, the families are laser focused on trying to transition that farm to their heirs. And so that is, I'm going to say 95% of the time that when there's a transition that occurs. The other 5% of the time is to non-family members, and it's been real fun to watch some of those happen where the farm family has to go out and find their successor and find the way to navigate that. So, and I would say rarely do I see a liquidation.
So business succession planning is definitely a process. What
Yeah.
business elements are part of that? I mean, do they need to occur in a certain order?
Yeah. So as families start to address this, like I said, I've been working on this for a while. I've kind of divided it into three buckets, and I think they go like this. The first thing to transition is management, right? And management transition ends up really being the confidence. It's the opportunity for next generation two. If generation one is transitioning the farm to generation two, it's really generations two opportunity to um, to build confidence that they can do it. Right? They can take over the day to day. They can get things accomplished. They can execute the plan on a daily basis, and that's really the first step. And then um, I'll use this example. I'm not sure it's the perfect example, but if you want to own an airplane, which I don't own an airplane, but if you want to own an airplane, you likely want to own it by yourself, but you may need to own it with somebody else. And you want to have confidence in the other owner that they're going to manage the plane so that it's safe and whatnot. So you may work with them for a little bit until you have confidence that you want to own the plane with them. I would say a farm is very similar. And so once you've generated the confidence, then the ownership piece comes, and the next generation generally wants to have a little skin in the game. And that ownership process can begin to occur when generation one knows that the business is in good hands. And then I would say the last piece of that is really the leadership. And I find that is the hardest thing for families to transition, because um, you may have a matriarch or a patriarch in the business who kind of has always been the leader. They've always been the visionary. And so transitioning that piece to the next gen generally takes some time. That does not happen right away for sure. It's rare if it does. So
Yeah, absolutely. And leadership and management. And I liked your analogy talking about, buying an airplane. There's a lot of different aspects to consider there. What specifically do we need to see maybe from the business side before that farm is ready for succession or the next transition?
yeah, I would say from the business's side, think of it this way. Generation one needs to prepare the business for as if it's to be sold, right? Um, and so if you're going to the market and you want to sell a business, you generally want that business to be relevant. You want it to be the right size, the right scale, the right sophistication. You want it to have quality assets that people are willing to invest in, and you obviously want it to be profitable, and you want it to cash flow. Investors are interested in distributions. They want return. And so if you aren't building that as generation one, looking to transition it to generation two, um, the second question that from the generation two side I see coming in, and I encourage Gen two to ask this question of themselves: is this a business that I would want to own? Right? Is this something that if it weren't for the related party element here, would I actually be interested in buying this business? And I think what I see is that so often there's this expectation that Gen 2 is going to take it over from Gen 1. And I just think if they stood back for a minute and they thought of it as a third party transaction, like I actually need to make sure that I've prepared my business for sale so that Gen 2 wants to be the buyer, wants to be the owner. Um, those are generally from the business side, those are the things that should happen ahead. Do they always? No, no, not always. And I've watched situations where Gen 1 gets to the end of their time, where they can see the end of their time, and they haven't done a good job of trying to make sure their assets are quality assets generating decent returns. And then we have this moment where everybody says, I'm not sure Gen 2 says, I'm not sure this is for me, or I'm not excited about coming back and joining this. So I think it's maybe a wake-up call for Generation 1 as much as anything, that don't take Generation 2 as your exit strategy for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. That leads to my next question about, the willing predecessor versus the qualified successor. Walk us through next scenario, person or group coming on board, and the different approach you have to work with for each of those.
Yeah, I would say as we talk about the predecessor and the successor, the predecessor is the outgoing party. In order for business succession to work, and to be effective and efficient, Generation 1, the predecessor, needs to be ready to make their move. They have to come to terms with the fact that I'm ready to start the process. And then, and it's really interesting to watch owners try to wrestle with that. It's the finality. We all go through this at some point in our lives where we have to wrestle with, am I ready to retire or not? And hopefully we do it once. But in a lot of cases, there are people that don't do it once and they get a little practice. But they need to be ready and willing to step aside to engage the process. And then they also need to leave themselves enough time to execute. I think of a family that I worked with recently here where, Gen 1 is in their 90s, Gen 2 is in their 60s. And I think about, okay, have we left ourselves enough time practically? And why did it take us so long for Gen 1 to be ready to make their move? So, and then from the successors side, I would just say, when Gen 1 is evaluating their successor choices, and it may be one, it may be many, are they competent and are they capable? And when will you know the answer to both? Which is a little tricky because you kind of need to get them, they need to have some external experience, or they need to sit in the seat on the farm so that you can evaluate whether they're competent and capable, and are they bringing things back to the farm that are, I would say, values, traits, attributes, skills that make sense for the next generation.
And you talked about if there's multiple errors. What about those ones that, like you said, maybe are not focused on that day-to-day of the business, that more concerned about that one-time transaction? How does succession plans incorporate those folks?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Ann. The Generation 2 generally has an heir apparent, right? And then there's those others who have identified that they are not the heir apparent, and they have either gone and found something else to do, or were never really interested in the farm to begin with. But then it depends on how important family is to the family, like including making sure that they have treated their heirs fair. Fair and equal are not necessarily the same thing, but they've wrestled with the fair and equal piece. And if some of those non-farming heirs still want to participate, then how do we include them? There's two things here. If they want to participate, how do we include them in business ownership so that they get a fair return for their share of the business, but they don't have the ability to, I'm going to say, upset the apple cart, right? We spent generations trying to put together the farm. We don't need a generation to dismantle the farm. So we need to be careful in how we do that. And then if they're not interested in being part of that long term, then maybe what are the assets that we want to carve off and say, all right, here's your piece. You're not part of the farm operation. You won't see distributions from the farm like the rest of the family will, but we're going to give you your piece of the pie, the piece of the rock. And so that may be a parcel of land. It generally isn't buildings. It's usually land. It's not equipment. It's usually those things that are easy to manage or easy to quickly turn into cash.
So let's talk outside the family. Who should Gen 1, do they need to go to for help with putting together this succession plan for the farm?
Yeah, I advocate for building a team. Um, and the number of members on the team may be different for each family. Um, if you have a tax advisor who is interested in more than just the tax liability and trying to manage the tax liability, um, uh, then maybe the tax advisor can play multiple hats, or the attorney can wear multiple hats. But I carve the hats out in three sections. One, somebody needs to be watching the tax liability for sure. It's probably the thing that holds us up from transitioning is the uncertainty of paying tax and how much tax will this trigger. So it likely will trigger tax. Everybody needs to be familiar or be aware of that. It's just how much tax does it trigger is the key. The right legal structure, so having an attorney on the team um, would be great, should be great. Um, in some cases, some of these entities aren't really, we might have folks who are in I'll just use C corps for example, and C corps um, were real popular, in the 80s. Um, we may be functioning in C corps, but there may be a better entity to transition through than the C corp. And then I would say finally, so that's the tax advisor, the attorney, and then third would be some sort of facilitator. And I I've played that role. I'm not a CPA, I'm not an attorney, but I've certainly played the role of facilitator here as we try to keep the process moving and make sure communication is happening um, throughout that, and try to help folks understand what it is they're actually doing. Um, uh, Sometimes we can get lost in tax code and legalese, and so trying to help folks navigate that and ask some questions and keep the process moving, that ends up being a pretty valuable part of the process.
So just even gathering that team is a process in itself. I mean, you mentioned the scenario with Gen 1 in their 90s. I mean, what's a realistic timeline for putting together a succession plan? When should people maybe consider be getting serious about it, putting this team together and getting something
Yeah.
in writing?
No, great question again, Ann. The I've seen folks start it as early as their mid 40s, and I'll tell you what really allowed that individual to start was he had confidence in generation two, being competent and capable, and um, so they got started. They weren't in a hurry. Uh, Gen two knew that this was their path. Um, but generally I don't see, it's kind of the standard bell curve here. Generally you don't see it happening at 45. Generally you don't see it happening at 90. Generally you see it happening somewhere in that mid 50s. People are starting to talk about it. They're starting to kind of learn what their options are. They're starting to kind of form and build their team, and you know, most of them have their eye on the ball that, in 10 years, if I start in my mid 50s, by the time I'm in my mid 60s, I could have this transitioned effectively. And just because one of the things too is, and maybe as a sidebar, just because the generation one has transitioned out doesn't mean they have to be out. Just means they may not be owners. They can still participate. And I think lots of folks have tried to make sure that those doors are open, right? There's a new manager, maybe a new leader and new owners, but you can still participate in the farm. It's a family farm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Um, Obviously, you talked about the 10 years there. generally people speaking are thinking about that, let's talk about the best, worst scenarios you've seen in succession planning. I imagine some of the worst have been, those unexpected life events. They had no plan in place. They thought they had time. Um, Walk us through, where you've seen some opportunities and some challenges.
Yeah, no, that's the worst. You identified the worst. The worst is when we haven't done any planning, um, we haven't engaged the process, and something catastrophic happens, and now we're scrambling, right? That's not ideal in any way, shape, or form. I would say close seconds go a little something like this. The business has changed and grown over the years. Um, but generation one, likely, what do they know? They know what their experience was when they took over the farm from from their parents, right? And so when dad tries to use the same playbook on a farm that's vastly different, maybe in its size, scale, sophistication, tax laws have changed, um, preferred entity structures have changed. To try to use dad's playbook is not generally does not work well. Um, so I would say for those folks who find themselves in that spot, you need to be a student of your options. Um, there's a ton of information in the space to go find. I mean, things like this are a perfect example. Webcasts or other ways to learn about what your options are. But um, don't use dad's playbook. I'll just use that. That's item number one. Um, Number two would be generation one being very proprietary about their plan. They've gone to the attorney. They put a will together. They maybe have a trust, but they don't share any of the details with anybody. So Gen two sits there wondering how this plays out, and they're a little bit hamstrung, and it's not productive. I'll just say that people are very can be very private, and they think this is a private moment when in fact this is something that needs to be shared widely with your family so that everybody really understands what the rules of engagement are and kind of what your wishes are as you kind of work through the transition. So um, the third thing I see is when generation one has a tight grip on the business. So management, ownership, and leadership, they've got a tight grip, a firm grip, and they won't give generation two the opportunity to, what I'm going to say is, fail forward. Give them a little bit of room to make some mistakes so that they can learn and you can kind of work together on solving. I think that's another situation. And then the last one is the 90-year-old example. It's just starting too late, right? I feel terrible for those folks who are in their 60s waiting for their parents to transition the farm. Like they never got the opportunity, and maybe there was a capable and competent element to that, and maybe there's a reason, but um, often I don't see that. It's just generation one having a hard time letting go.
Yeah, that tight grip you talked about, and if they're being private as those plans as well, it just adds just another layer to that.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
As we wrap up our discussion today, I just want to remind our audience, if you have a question for Jim, feel free to type it in the chat there, or your comments in social media, and we'll try to get them here before the end of the half hour here. Jim, lessons learned here from your lifelong career in agribusiness, what would be your top 3 pieces of advice when it comes to succession planning?
Yeah. Top number 1 goes like this. We call it succession planning because there's an element of planning that must take place. We need to dedicate energy, time, resources to the effort, engage the team, make sure that we're planful in how we move forward, and it doesn't make sure that it's not a fire drill, right? We give ourselves time to evaluate, what options best fit us, and we just give ourselves, we're just planful. That I see that is like this is one of those things when you're busy with day to day. This is one of those things that's very easy to defer, right? I'm gonna kick the can till tomorrow, and I'll make the call tomorrow, or I'll sit down and actually start trying to think through this, or I'll start studying my options tomorrow, and pretty soon tomorrow's here, and we should have already transitioned the farm. So that's number one. Number two is this communication. Communication is the key to this, and coming back to it on a regular basis. That's where the facilitator is so important. The facilitator is going to make sure that we all get back to the table to have a conversation and move the ball forward, because it goes in steps, right? And it's not a one and done. It's not a build the plan and then execute the plan and walk away. That's not generally how it works. It takes some time to move through it, and you have to communicate. I would say also, on the communication side, make sure if you're generation one, make sure you're having your conversations with generation two to make sure that you're not assuming that they're your exit strategy, right? Because they may not be assuming the same thing. They may be a little more guarded and saying, gosh, it might be a thing that they don't know if they can do it, right? They look at the job you've done and they're not sure they can do that. So I just wouldn't assume that generation two is your exit strategy. Make sure that they have buy-in before you start down the process. And then three, as like I said, is facilitation. And I would just say this is an evolution. You may get 5 years into it and something might change, right? And so we have to be able to ebb and flow with reality and day to day in the business, and we may need to call an audible every once in a while in the plan. So those are the big pieces that I've learned as I've worked with families as we go through these things. But can't underscore the team enough. Need to make sure you have the right players on the team so you can be successful.
Absolutely. Great insight. Excellent points there on succession planning. Jim Marsoff, Vice President of Business for Pipestone. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Thank you for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We also appreciate all of you being with us. We want to thank our platinum sponsors, United Animal Health and USDA APHIS, for their support for today's event. Stay tuned as we aim to keep the industry conversation going throughout the year. Be sure to watch for upcoming Global Hog Industry Virtual Conference updates over the next few months. For National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.